Sign the house over to your brother or don't bother coming to the funeral. My aunt didn't even look up from her phone when she said it. She was standing in the middle of my grandfather's kitchen, the one he'd built with his own hands in 1974, flipping through something on her screen while his hospital bed sat empty in the next room. He'd been gone for 11 hours. She was already redistributing assets. My brother Daniel was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching me with that flat, patient expression. He saves for negotiations. He knows he's already won. My cousin Brent was by the back door, pretending to check his watch. They weren't grieving. They were managing a transaction. And I was the last item on the agenda. I looked at my aunt's hands. The same hands that had co-signed a loan in my name when I was 19 without telling me. The same hands that had intercepted the mail at my grandfather's house for the past 4 years, filtering out anything addressed to me. I looked at those hands and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage. Not grief. Clarity. I'm a forensic accountant. My firm pays me to find the money people think they've hidden. I follow paper trails the way other people follow GPS. I walk into a set of books and I can tell within 20 minutes whether someone is stealing. And I can usually tell you for how long. That is my job. That is what I do every single day. And standing there in my grandfather's kitchen, looking at the 3 people who had spent a decade treating me like a filing cabinet, they only opened when they needed something. I realized I had been doing everyone's audit except my own family's. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I told them I needed a few days to process everything. That losing Grandpa Harold had hit me harder than I expected. That I wasn't in a state to sign anything right now. My aunt made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a hiss. Daniel put his hand on my shoulder and told me to take the time I needed. That family sticks together. That Grandpa would have wanted this handled cleanly. He said Grandpa's name like he owned it. I drove home to my apartment in East Vancouver. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, and I started to build a file, to understand why I didn't just walk away. You have to understand what my grandfather was to me, and what I was to him. My mother died when I was 8. She was his youngest daughter, the one he called his compass. After she was gone, Grandpa Harold became the fixed point in my life. He drove me to swim practice at 5:30 in the morning. He sat in the front row, at every school play, even the terrible ones. When I got into university in Toronto, he handed me an envelope with $17,000 in it and told me he'd been putting away $50 a month since the day I was born. He called it my future fund. He said no one could touch it but me. He was wrong about that part. Daniel is 11 years older than me. He had Grandpa's ear, in a way I never understood until I got older. By the time I was finishing my undergrad, Daniel had positioned himself as the family financial manager. He handled Grandpa's investment accounts. He helped with the property taxes. He became the person Grandpa called when something needed doing. Which meant Daniel became the person who controlled what Grandpa knew and didn't know. I found out about the credit card 3 years after I graduated. A collections notice arrived at my old address, which happened to still be Grandpa's house. Which meant it arrived at Daniel's hands first. He forwarded it to me only after the account had already been sent to collections. A visa in my name. Opened when I was in 2nd year. $12,000. Charges for a home renovation that happened at my aunt's house. Not mine. I had never seen the card. I had never received a statement. I had never spent $1 of it. Daniel told me it was a mistake. He told me he'd look into it. He told me these things happen when you share an address. I was 23, and I believed him because he was my brother, and because Grandpa trusted him, and because I didn't yet understand that the people who steal from you most efficiently are the ones you've already decided to trust. I paid it off. I swallowed the $12,000 because fighting it felt like fighting my grandfather's peace. And his health was already starting to decline. I told myself I'd deal with it later. Later has a way of becoming never. By the time Grandpa Harold was in palliative care last spring, Daniel had full power of attorney over his finances. My aunt, his only surviving child besides my mother's memory, had the healthcare proxy. I had visiting rights and a parking pass for the hospice. I visited every day. I brought him tea biscuits from the bakery on Robson Street that he'd been eating since 1987. I read him the hockey scores even though the Canucks were breaking his heart as usual. 3 weeks before he died. On a Tuesday afternoon, when the light was coming through the blinds in thin gold strips, he took my hand and told me he had done something he needed me to know about. He said he'd talked to a lawyer. He said he'd set something up a long time ago that nobody else knew about. Something just for me. Because he had always known that the wolves would come circling when he was gone. He said the name Mercer. He said the word trust. He fell asleep before he could finish the sentence. And he never had full clarity again after that. I wrote the name Mercer in my phone. The will. When it was read 6 days after the funeral. Left the house and the investment portfolio to Daniel and my aunt in equal shares. It left me a pearl brooch that had belonged to my grandmother, and a savings bond worth $800. Daniel watched my face when the executor read that part. There was something in his expression that wasn't grief and wasn't guilt. It was relief. The relief of a man who had been waiting a long time for a particular door to close. I kept my face completely still. I had spent 3 years auditing pharmaceutical companies. I know how to sit in a room full of people who are hiding something and give them nothing. That night I searched every law firm in Metro Vancouver with the name Mercer. I found 3. I called all 3 the next morning, asking for anyone who had worked with a Harold Kowalski. The third one called me back within an hour. Her name was Patricia Mercer. She was a trust and estate lawyer with an office in Kitsilano. She told me she'd been waiting for my call. We met the next afternoon. Her office smelled like cedar and old files. A good smell. The smell of things that last. She slid a document across her desk before I had even taken my coat off. It was a discretionary trust agreement. Executed 4 years ago. Witnessed. Notarized. And registered. My grandfather had established it quietly. Funded it with a rental property he owned in Burnaby that Daniel didn't know about because it had been in my grandmother's name and had transferred to Grandpa by survivorship 20 years ago. Off the radar of the family finances, Daniel managed. The trust named me as sole beneficiary. Patricia Mercer, as trustee. The Burnaby property had been assessed at $980,000. The trust had been generating rental income for 4 years. Patricia had been holding the statements. I sat in that chair for a very long time. Grandpa Harold had known. He had watched his son position himself over the finances. He had watched the credit card incident and seen the shape of what was coming. He had gone quietly to a lawyer his daughter would never have chosen, and he had built a wall around one last thing and put my name on it. I didn't cry until I got back to my car. Then I dried my face, and I got to work. I spent the next 3 weeks doing what I do professionally. I pulled every piece of paper I could legally access. I ordered my own credit reports going back 10 years through Equifax and TransUnion. I found 2 accounts I hadn't known about. The visa from university I already knew. And a line of credit opened 4 years ago. $17,000 drawn and repaid in a pattern that looked like cash cycling. The kind of movement forensic accountants flag immediately as structuring. The address on the account was Grandpa Harold's house. The signature on the application looked like mine, the way a photocopy of a photocopy looks like the original. I photographed everything. I built a timeline. I created a folder in an encrypted drive that I named Harold. Because everything I was doing in the name of a man who had put $50 a month into an envelope for 25 years just to make sure I would be okay. Daniel called twice during those 3 weeks. He asked when I was planning to deal with the property paperwork. He said there were decisions that needed to be made. He said he just wanted to get things settled so we could all move forward. His voice had that careful quality it always gets when he's performing patience for an audience. Except the audience was just me. And I've known him my whole life. I told him I was still processing. I told him, grief takes time. He said he understood completely. Then I called the one person I needed. His name is Robert Fillion. He's a civil litigation lawyer in downtown Vancouver. The kind of man who has absolutely no interest in being charming, and is consequently one of the most trustworthy people I've ever met. I had worked with him twice on fraud cases. Once when I was the expert witness and once when I was the one who handed him the file that made his case. He listened to everything I had without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause. He said, "Are you ready to do this properly?" I said, "I've been ready for 3 years." He filed a notice of application to the BC Supreme Court, challenging the validity of the will on grounds of undue influence, and requesting a full accounting of all financial transactions during the period of Daniel's power of attorney. At the same time, Patricia Mercer formally notified all parties of the existence of the Burnaby Trust, under BC's Wills, Estates and Succession Act. A trustee has standing to intervene in estate proceedings when the trust assets may be affected, The notice landed on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, Daniel had called me 4 times. I let them all go to voicemail. By Friday, he had retained a lawyer. By the following Monday, my aunt was calling from a number I didn't recognize, which meant she knew I wouldn't answer if I saw her name. I let that one go to voicemail too. The mediation was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Robert chose the location: a boardroom on the 18th floor of a building on West Georgia Street. Floor-to-ceiling windows. The North Shore mountains visible through the glass, like a reminder that certain things do not move no matter who pulls on them. I arrived 12 minutes early. I wore a charcoal blazer and the pearl brooch my grandfather had left me. I pinned it to my lapel before I left the apartment. It was the only thing I wore that morning that had not been chosen strategically. But it turned out to be the most important thing in the room. They were already there when I walked in. Daniel in a gray suit. Looking composed, the way people look when they've rehearsed composure. My aunt with her hands folded on the table, and an expression that wanted to be maternal, but kept sliding into something more calculated. Their lawyer was young. Aggressive-looking in the way articling students sometimes are, before they've lost enough cases. Robert Fillion sat at the far end of the table, a closed folder in front of him. Looking completely bored. There was a mediator. There was a court reporter. Robert had requested one. Daniel's lawyer had objected. Robert had pointed out that his client had a documented pattern of having important conversations disputed after the fact, and the mediator had agreed to allow it. Everything said in this room is on the record. The mediator said, "We're here to discuss the estate of Harold Kowalski and to attempt resolution of the pending application." Daniel's lawyer opened. There was no basis for the challenge. The will had been properly executed. Harold Kowalski had been of sound mind. My client had served as power of attorney out of filial duty, and there was full transparency throughout. He looked at me when he said transparency. I looked back at him the way I look at a set of books I already know are cooked. My aunt spoke next. She said I had always been difficult. She said Grandpa Harold had struggled with my attitude in his final years. She said the will reflected his true wishes, and that my challenge was causing the family unnecessary pain. She pressed her lips together in a way that was meant to look sad. The court reporter's fingers didn't stop moving. Then Daniel spoke. He said he understood I was grieving. He said he didn't blame me for being upset. He said that Grandpa had provided for me in other ways over the years, and that the estate distribution was simply a reflection of different relationships and different levels of contribution to his care. He spoke carefully, each sentence constructed like a legal brief. When he finished, Robert Fillion opened his folder for the first time. He slid a document to the center of the table. It was a credit application. My name, my date of birth, my social insurance number, Daniel's handwriting in the address field, which I recognized because I had seen it my entire life. On birthday cards, on Christmas labels, on a letter he'd sent me when I was at university, telling me to call Grandpa more often. "Where were you on April 14th? 2019, Robert asked him. Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's the date this application was submitted in your sister's name." Robert continued. "From the IP address registered to your home on Commercial Drive." The young lawyer started to say something. Robert slid another document across the table. This one was a bank statement. The line of credit draws. 16 transactions over 14 months. Each one below $10,000. Below the threshold that triggers automatic reporting to FinTrack. The Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center of Canada. Structuring. Robert said simply, "That's a federal offense under the Proceeds of Crime and Terrorist Financing Act. It carries up to 5 years. The fraudulent credit application is a separate count under the Criminal Code. Section 380. Another 5. The room was quiet in a specific way. The way rooms get quiet when everyone in them suddenly understands that the conversation they thought they were having is not the conversation that is actually happening. My aunt's hands came apart on the table. Robert reached into the folder again. This time he produced a printed sheet. An income summary. 4 years of rental income from the Burnaby property held in trust. Monthly deposits. Quarterly statements. A total that had grown while my grandfather was alive, and had continued growing after he was gone, because the trust didn't die with him. The trust Patricia Mercer has administered since its execution, Robert said, currently holds $1.1 million in property, equity, and accrued rental income. My client is the sole beneficiary. The trustee has already initiated the transfer process. Daniel looked at me. It was the first time he'd really looked at me since I walked in. I don't know what he was searching for. Whatever it was. I don't think he found it. There's more, Robert said. He placed the final document on the table. It was a sworn affidavit from the night nurse who had attended my grandfather in his final 2 weeks at the hospice. In it, she described a conversation she had witnessed between Daniel and my grandfather, 5 days before Harold Kowalski died. She described my grandfather asking where I was. She described Daniel telling him I had called to say I was too busy to visit that week. She described the look on Harold's face when he heard that I had visited every single day that week. I have the parking validations to prove it. The hospice has me on their visitor log every afternoon at 1:15. Daniel had told a dying man that his granddaughter couldn't be bothered to come. The young lawyer leaned over and spoke quietly into Daniel's ear. Daniel listened. His face went through several things. Robert slid the settlement agreement across the table. It was straightforward. Daniel and my aunt would withdraw all objection to the trust distribution. They would acknowledge the fraudulent credit accounts and agree to full restitution of the $29,000 across both accounts, plus interest, calculated from the dates of origination. They would sign a statutory declaration confirming they had no further claim on any asset connected to Harold Kowalski's estate. Permanent no contact. Enforced by civil injunction. Breach of which would trigger immediate referral of the criminal file to the RCMP's Financial Integrity Unit, which Robert had already been in preliminary contact with. A fact he mentioned the way you mentioned the weather. And if we don't agree, my aunt asked. Her voice had changed. It had lost the maternal register entirely. Then we proceed with the estate challenge, Robert said, which will require full court disclosure of all financial records from the period of power of attorney, which will be public. And I refer the criminal matter today rather than as a condition of breach. He paused. The RCMP has a good working relationship with the CRA. They tend to look at everything together. Daniel picked up the pen. He signed without looking at me again. My aunt signed with the deliberate movements of someone trying to appear unbothered by something that is clearly bothering them enormously. Their lawyer closed his folder and did not say goodbye. I walked to the window while Robert gathered his documents. 18 floors below. West Georgia Street ran toward the water. The mountains were still there. Exactly where they'd been when I walked in. I reached up and touched the pearl brooch. The Burnaby property sold 4 months later. The equity, combined with the rental income in trust, cleared just over $1,140,000 after fees and taxes. I paid off my student loans. I paid off my car. I set aside 6 months of living expenses. I made a donation to the palliative care unit at the hospice where my grandfather spent his last weeks. In Harold Kowalski's name, I bought a 1-bedroom condo in East Van with a view of the mountains you can see from the kitchen window on clear days. I signed the papers on a Tuesday morning in October. The notary handed me the keys and congratulated me, and I stood in the parking lot for a minute just holding them. Daniel and my aunt moved out of my grandfather's house when it went into the estate proceedings. They're renting somewhere in the Fraser Valley. I don't know exactly where. And that's the way the injunction is designed. Brent I never hear from. He was never the architect of any of it. Just someone who stood at the back door and watched. Which is its own kind of choice, but not my problem to carry. What I carry is this: my grandfather knew. He watched everything happening around him, and he couldn't stop it. And he couldn't confront it directly, because he was an 81-year-old man, in declining health, who just wanted to die without his family destroying itself in front of him. So he did the one thing he could do quietly. He went to a lawyer no one else knew. He signed a document no one else saw. He protected the one person he wanted to protect. And he trusted that she would find her way to Patricia Mercer's office, eventually. He was right. I still have the parking validations from that last week. I keep them in the same folder as the trust agreement. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because they're proof of something that felt important to document. That I showed up. That I kept showing up even when someone was telling him I hadn't. That some records don't lie. And some paper trails lead somewhere worth following. Have you ever had to audit your own family just to prove you existed in their lives? Tell me in the comments. And if you're reading this from somewhere far away, tell me what time it is there. I want to know how far this story reaches.